so much for an introduction, and thank you, Giovanna, for allowing me to be here. I'm really appreciating this opportunity. I'm very grateful for being able to give this talk here today. So today I'm going to talk about words that appear close to heart, words that are important for us because they somehow are metaphorized as being inside us somewhere there in our interiorities. So I started this project because I'm deeply inspired by this persistent and mutual omnipresence of the metaphor of the heart as the site of human agency, feeling, and thought. So even today, despite all the different neuroscientific findings that clearly indicate that our cognitive functioning depends on the circuits in the brain, not on the heart. The heart is actually just the muscle that keeps pumping the blood outside into the body through arteries and then gets the blood through veins. Somehow we still continue to think about the heart as this place where the most important values and emotions are stored. So to English speakers, or to Polish speakers for that matter, it makes a lot of sense when someone says, I'm heartbroken, even if we know that their heart is in one piece. So in China, actually, this is also the case. You can see that. So consider the song of the famous and recently, unfortunately, quite controversial singer Wang Chu, "You Exist in My Song." In particular, the two lines of the chorus. I'm not going to sing it. You're welcome to look it up later after the talk if you don't know it. Let's just read the two first lines of the chorus together. 你存在我深深的脑海里，我的梦里，我的心里，我的歌声 exist in the oceans of my mind, in my dream, in my heart, in my song. So there are a lot of metaphors of interiority here already, right? We see a certain dissonance between, on the one hand, the acknowledgement that the brain has something to do with emotions. So the character now here means brain, actually, although it is softened here, it's used kind of in a metaphorical way. And in the following line, she sings about the heart, Xin Li, right here, which indicates the presence of this centuries-old cardiocentric conceptuality, despite the growing awareness that, again, the brain is actually where the mind and consciousness emerge. So as Ning Yu, a professor of applied linguistics and Asian studies at the Pennsylvania State University, puts it, the word Xin, heart, plays a far more prominent and important role in Chinese phraseology than the word now for brain. And he explains that through cultural influence. So, quote, I would attribute the relatively strong presence of the heart and weak presence of the brain in the conceptualizations of cognitive functions, both mental and emotional, to the shaping and molding force of the cultural models based on ancient Chinese thought and traditional Chinese medicine. So in many respects, I think he is totally right. So this song was released in 2012, and it became an instant success in China. When I was back in China doing my master's, people would still sing it in KTVs. I'm not sure that it still happens now after her mother was kind of involved in a scandal and corruption scandal, but the song is still very popular. In fact, if we go back 2,400 years in history to Mencius, an early Chinese philosopher, the so-called second sage, follows Confucius. He actually advised the political leadership of his time to convince their subjects through virtue rather than violence. So he's commenting here on the misrule of the evil kings Jie and Zhou, and he says, quote, you use physical force to compel a person to submit, but this is not the case of them submitting in spirit. It is simply that their physical strength is insufficient to resist. If you induce a person to submit by the power of your virtue, on the other hand, they will be happy and content in their innermost xin or heart mind or hearts, however you want to translate that. That's another question. This constitutes genuine submission. So both actually versions sound quite ominous to me, whether through virtue or through violence. But what I think Maciej is saying here is that, as Di Varela puts it, any social project that is not imposed through force alone must be affective in order to be effective. So Ning Yu, after all, might be right. The metaphor is very persistent, and there's a lot of metaphorical inertia here. It continues. Despite this neuroscientific findings, again, we see the heart appear and again in the archive and in Chinese literary corpora. But to state my argument, I believe that there's more than just cultural influence at play here. So it is not just that people who grow up surrounded with conventionalized expressions about the heart that thinks and feels automatically accept this metaphor. There are reasons to believe that our cognitive and physiological architecture actually privileges and promotes metaphors of interiority, and it does so universally and cross-culturally. So it is also not the case that nothing changed through thousands of years of the so-called Chinese tradition, as Yu's argument would make us believe. From another angle, one surely realizes, especially in our postmodernist age, that the metaphor interiority can be quite misleading. So as Haiyan Li puts it, my advisor puts it, quote, whether it whispers or wails, the heart always already speaks in borrowed tongues. So these different tensions between continuity and discontinuity, between internalism and externalism, have been at the forefront of academic debates and intellectual inquiries during the last 50 years at least. And I believe that the age can actually offer a unique perspective to these questions. The computational modeling of cultural phenomena that can combine existing perspectives, I will outline them momentarily, and offer new ways to think about interiority and emotionality, especially as expressed in text. So first of all, what I would suggest here, and this will take roughly the first half of this talk, is a certain organization of existing knowledge about interiority as a concept. So this is my attempt to kind of make sense of existing paradigms and how they supplement, but at the same time undermine each other. And this is necessary because only in this way can we actually acknowledge the contribution of the age to how we think about these questions. Okay, so let's start with the temporal axis with the diachronic pole. So here, the diachronic pole concentrates the theoretical frameworks that dominated the humanistic inquiry within the last, I would say, 50 years. It's an outgrowth, I think, of the 1960s still. And notably, Foucault's genealogy has determined the way we think about cultural artifacts as reflections of discursive formation that supersede each other according to changing relations of power, and how these changes can retrospectively actually shed new light on the present practices and institutions that we often take for granted. And here it is important because his thought actually brings home the fact that modern subjectivity, and by the same token, modern emotionality, is constructed. It is the result of new body technologies that imprison ourselves in an infinitely self-referring observation that is characteristic to modernity. So panopticism, characterizes not only the prison system, but also our own attitude to emotions, the government of feelings, which are surveilled, analyzed, imaged, monitored, whether through disciplinary, biopolitical, or scientific means. This space obviously also includes the new left thinkers like Jameson or Eagleton, who appeal to us to always historicize and always see cultural phenomena as kind of reflections of historical processes. On the Chinese side, I think the diachronic approach is most clearly visible in considerations of modernity and modern China. So the title of David Wong's recently edited volume, A New Literary History of Modern China, is actually self-explanatory. So the book is organized in a chronological fashion. It moves like year by year, if not month by month, and showing us how literary phenomena kind of reflect socio-historical processes in China. But this is not the only level of granularity. And for example, Professor Haiyan Li, a major source of inspiration for this project, does something similar, although she distinguishes between structures of feeling that are longer, right? So she is between Confucian, Enlightenment, and revolutionary structures of feeling. And because the modern subject is a sentimental subject, by analyzing what happens in the hearts of literary characters, we can also see what happens in China more broadly. So to sum up, these approaches would see emotions as reflections of socio-historical processes. They are also critical of any notion of universality. By necessity, they are informed by this post-colonialist endeavor to focus on the particular. But history is just one way of thinking about this problem, about emotionality. We have also the synchronic pole here. And the scholars who believe that these phenomena, emotional phenomena, are actually timeless and universal. So we have, for example, Patrick Hogan, who argues for narrative universals. He says that anyone who pays attention to the vast body of literary data by and examines it cross-culturally, cannot help but be struck by the uniformity of narrative structures and of the emotion ideas that are inseparable from those structures. So rather than thinking about what is the difference between romanticism, realism, or neoclassicism, or modernism and postmodernism, we need to acknowledge that texts are produced by people, and people are, quote, incomparably more alike than not. So we share ideas, perceptions, desires, and aspirations, and what is most important, emotions. And because we do that, stories about these aspirations and emotions are just variations on a handful of shared patterns. So let's see, Lockett recently in a great book on Anglo-Saxon psychology builds on the same kind of approach, using conceptual metaphor theory to think of this representation of interiority in different traditions. So from Homer to Hesiod to pre-Socratic philosophers, through Hebrew Bible, Old Saxon biblical poetry, Jamaican concepts of mind, the Punjabis, the Niwa ethnic groups in Kathmandu Valley. She also analyzes the Korean, Japanese language. I mean, analyzes, she draws to simply incorporate these findings from these different cultural traditions, including African languages, including Zulu and Wolof, the Hungarian language. All these different traditions actually offer plenty of evidence for the universal presence of cardiocentric psychology. So the site of mental faculties is invariably localized in the midsection of the body, within the chest, not often in the heart. And the argument is that this cardiocentric psychology and hydraulic model are ultimately rooted in the coactivity of intense mental thinking with sensations of heat, seething, constrictions in the chest that people tend to experience when having these powerful cognitive experiences. There's also Ning Yu, already mentioned, who demonstrates the central importance of the heart in human cognition and human experience as conceptualized in the so-called Chinese culture, which is metaphorized. The heart is metaphorized as the ruler of the body, and this is then metaphorized as also applicable to Chinese politics, whereby the lord, the Jun or the governor, is basically also the heart of the empire. So the heart is conceptualized, as he says, as the ruler of the body, which in turn is conceived as the microcosm of the state. But again, this is not only characteristic to Chinese texts, and we can see that William Harvey, the guy, the English physician who is credited with recognizing the full circulation of the blood in the human body, he actually dedicated his book, the Motu Cordis, to Charles I. And in this dedication, he also says that Charles I is the heart of his Commonwealth. So this is brought to our awareness by Robert Erickson in his book, The Language of the Heart. So while the diachronic people will say that we should always historicize, the synchronic arguments show that there is a certain universality of human phenomenology. And I don't think that it's been possible to actually somehow break this impasse and to reconcile these two poles so far. Okay, let's quickly move to the spatial axis. The discussion here is actually even more heated, and people kind of throw arguments, even stronger arguments against each other. So on the one hand, we have internalism. And here I think this is the cutting edge work of social psychologists and neuroscientists, such as Antonio Damasio, for example, who argues that the key to understanding living organisms, from those that are made up of one cell to those that are made of billions of cells, such as human beings, is the definition of their boundary. So the separation between what is in and what is out. The structure of the organism is inside the boundary, and the life of the organism is defined by the maintenance of internal states within the boundary. So singular individuality depends on the boundary. An evolutionary perspective supports this view. Emotions emerge because they simply protect our bodies. We feel fear when we see snakes, and this is somehow wired into our brain tissue so that we can actually make these immediate decisions to escape, etc. So this obviously goes against any easy dismissal of subjectivity a la Althusser or the new left thinkers who would claim that subject is merely a result of some kind of interpolation from the outside. So the notion of boundary must be somehow primordial to all organisms, and we need to kind of take this evidence into account. Yeah, Panksepp's work on basic emotions also argues actually that the most powerful feelings, the primal emotional affects, arise from ancient neural networks situated in brain regions below the neocortical thinking cap. So this ancestral mind resides in the midbrain, especially in a region known as periaqueductal gray, or the PG, which is responsible for regulation of heart rate, blood pressure, autonomic processes, fearful and defensive reactions, etc. Other regions include the hypothalamus, amygdala, basal ganglia, cingulate cortex, and hippocampus. And so basically the structures that evolutionary are much older than kind of neocortical parts of the human brain. So these feelings are not bright, they're not clever, but they are good enough to protect us from dangers and any other unfortunate things that could happen in our lives. So again, from the scientific perspective, subjectivity can be no more understood as a purely social phenomenon, a social construction. There's a continuity from the biological to the social. And while we do speak in borrowed tongues, some tongues are already hardwired into our bodies. From a somewhat different angle, it's still, I think, maybe somewhat controversially put here, but we can locate cognitive literary scholars such as Lisa Sunshine, who have demonstrated that human readers and human beings more generally need very little prompting to attribute an interiority to an external world. And Slingerland, as I already quoted from him, actually when talking about Mencius, he also debunks the kind of erroneous claims that the Chinese lack the notion of interiority, since there is no distinction between body and mind. There was no Descartes, and because there was no Descartes, we don't have this separation. There is no interiority to the Chinese psychology as a consequence. So he provides plenty of evidence to show that that's not the case. He also draws upon cognitive, qualitative, and literary data. And finally, on the externalist front, there is, again, a wealth of research focused on social constructiveness of emotions. So notably, Alan Palmer here analyzes social minds in the novel, and he draws upon the free indirect discourse to show that the mind extends beyond the skin. Thought is not only private and inaccessible, but also public and available as it can be expressed in physical terms. So the reader, or again, human being in social interaction, is able to construct the continuing consciousness of a character or of another person simply from descriptions of behavior, rather than having like direct access to consciousness. Barrett, Lisa Feldman Barrett, recently also proposed a controversial theory of constructed emotion. This is kind of constructivist term in, I think, recent psychology. It's kind of a deja vu for people who studied postmodernist theories of 1970s. Somewhat they are discovering that only now. So I think it's quite surprising. So she argues that there's no such thing as primal affects, and she refutes the argument that emotion categories we perceive and experience as distinct, such as anger and fear, actually have their counterparts in the human brain. As she said, human beings are not at the mercy of medical emotion circuits buried deep within animalistic parts of our highly evolved brain. We are architects of our own experience. And in the Chinese studies, to kind of give it a closure, we have Ding-Hong Lam's recent intervention about spatiality of emotion, and he draws his inspiration from the term qingjing, especially from the term qing, the first character, as you can see here, which in Chinese has two connotations. One is emotion, feeling, or sentiment, but it also means circumstance, situation. And he draws from that to say that emotion is actually always situated, the structure of space as an ontological condition without which we cannot even be outside in the world, getting along with each other. And he goes as far as to kind of completely dismiss the neuroscientific data because they are not ecologically valid. You can't really measure emotions in the lab. Like every situation is different, and we need to kind of acknowledge that. Okay, so we have the four dominant vectors of inquiry, and scholars of both ways argue exactly the opposite thing, and they unfortunately all sound pretty convincing. So how does DH come into this picture? So notice that in all outline paradigms, the texts are only anecdotally important, to quote Mark Alji-Hewitt. They function as mirrors of some other extra textual processes. By contrast, digital humanities force us to take text as text, assemblages of words put together in a certain order. So I suggest that one way to start thinking computationally about the representations of interiority is precisely by taking a closer look at words. So this is my corpus, divided into 5 different epistemes or historical periods, according to the usual cultural periodization that is still dominant in Chinese literary studies. So we have the Mingqing period, which includes some of the world's longest and oldest novels, such as the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, Journey to the West, or The Dream of the Red Chamber. They are usually put together by scholars of Chinese literature, maybe not by all. We have late Qing period, which starts after the Second Opium War and the intrusion of foreign powers into China. Then we move into Republican period after the establishment of the Republic. Here in the 1912, after the Xinhai Revolution, which overthrew the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. And then socialist period, the establishment of the People's, starting with the establishment of the People's Republic of China and the reign of Mao. And finally, we end up in our own time, which starts after Mao's death and witnesses Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, from which we have much more text than from other subcorpora, as you can see. So in total, this corpus, the assembled corpus, has roughly, I think, 50 million words. And because it's so unbalanced, especially given this wealth of contemporary texts, I use oversampling. So basically, I take more text from these 4 periods here to kind of balance the omnivorous kind of wealth of information that we get from the contemporary period. So in total, that gives us roughly 92 million words. There are 1,200,000 distinct word types. And among these 92 million tokens, 91,000 of them are hard related. So what I mean by hard related terms. So as you know, the Chinese languages use characters, and here we have the character Xin that already been shown many times on the screen, or Tham in Cantonese, which means heart. And since I'm interested in the representations of interiority, I'm interested in the words that convey some sense of interior space. So the character Xin can be followed by localizers. That will be Li, Zhong, Shang, Xia, Nei. And the explanations are on the right side. It can also appear in longer localized compounds, lexicalized units, which usually means that there is some other character attached to it. Again, we can attach the localizer from on the right side to the word. So Qin Li would mean inside one's heart. Qin Nei within one's heart is pretty much the same. And Xin can also appear in lexicalized items. For example, Zhong Xin in early modern text still means, or like the text in Mencius, right? It uses the term Zhong Xin to say the innermost heart. The same for Man Xin, the heart full of something. It's all these compounds somehow have something to do with interiority. And sometimes we can also combine it too. So we can say Nei Xin Li, like inside the inner heart or something like that. So even to, it's kind of redundant, but it strengthens the kind of interiority feel to it. And there are also ways to convey interiority with words that do not contain the word heart, such as inside one's chest or something like that, or pit of the stomach. These are the expressions that we also use in English. So these are my attempts at translating them. There are also some OCR errors that I need to take into account, but most of these terms mean simply inside one's heart or inside one's chest, inside the abdomen, however you want to translate it. There is the notion that emotions are somehow residing inside our bodies and sometimes in different organs within the body, right? Okay, so I need to replace all of these words with just one word because I want to measure how the meaning of interiority changed or not. So I replace all these words with, let's say, the word heart. But here it gets tricky. So I'm using something called a method called temporal referencing, recently suggested by Dubor-Tarski and his colleagues, which allows us to model lexical semantic change of words. And the idea is quite simple. So for specific target words, such as heart, we add a suffix to it, indicating a particular historical period. So for example, we want to see how the meaning of the word house change from 19th to 20th century. So what we do, we have two corpora, text from 19th century and text from 20th century. We add the suffix indicating the period. So house 20 and house 19 for 19th century text. And for us, these two words are still similar, right? With house 20, house 19, they must have something in common with each other. But for the computer, what happens is that they are changed into numbers. So each word type gets its own ID. So we completely remove all the information about them being in any way connected. They're just IDs in the data. So we have done this and we run word2vec on this whole corpus, which allows us to represent the meaning of words as vectors in multidimensional spaces. I will explain that in a second. And the goal is to measure the change only between these time-specific vector representations of the tagged words. We assume that everything else is relatively stable. We only need to see where the vectors move in space as we move from one epoch to another. Okay, so this is the word2vec intuition. I will very quickly go through that. So usually when we think about vectors, we think of them, high school math is like 2-3-dimensional spaces. We can draw them, do some calculations on them. For the computer, it actually does not matter how many dimensions we have. So here we have two vectors. They are 4-dimensional. There's 4 numbers. A vector is a list of numbers here, and each number is a value of this vector in this particular dimension. So here's 2. The first dimension is value 2, 0, -3, -3. And the cool thing we can do with vectors is we can compare them. We can say that two vectors are similar if the angle between them is small, right? The vectors that will be dissimilar will have a large angle between them. And the way we do that in bigger multidimensional spaces, actually for any n-dimensional space, is that we calculate the dot product of them and then scale it. But the dot product is simply the multiplications, pairwise multiplications of their respective dimensions. So 2 times 3 is a 6. 0 times 1 is 0, right? -3 times 4, 12, -12, and then 3 here. And we add these numbers together. And if this is a big number, then it means that the vectors it's all simplified. But if this is a big number, big positive number, as it were, then this means that the vectors are close to each other. If it's a big negative number, then it means that they are opposed. So you can see if two numbers are positive or two numbers are negative, the multiplication will contribute positively to this final sum, right? But if it turns out that in one dimension, the values in one vector is negative and other is positive, then the multiplication will reduce this final sum. And you can kind of see it here. These two vectors have positive values in both x and y, right? They're both turned to the right and top, whereas here, this vector b is to the right and to the top, whereas the vector a is to the left, to the bottom. So they have opposite sides, and therefore the angle is bigger, and therefore they are much different. So what word2vec is doing is simply trying to make, for example, in sorry, the cat is kind of cut in half. Sorry for that, but like it tries to put the cat vector for the word cat closer to the word cute. It tries to push the vector for the word cute closer to the vector cat, and it tries to push the vector cat, for example, away from the word lazy because they are not appearing close to each other. And actually, these are the update rules for all these 3 cases. Very quickly, this number, for example, is exactly this multiplication which I just said. So basically, you have outside vector, let's say cute, dot producted with central vector with the word cat. And if this number will be big, and by big I mean something close to 1, then 1 minus something close to 1 will give us 0. And that means that we need to push the central vector just a little bit towards the outside vector. So because they're already quite very similar, right? The value is large, it's close to 1. Because they're similar, we push it a little bit towards the word cute. We don't need to change much. However, think about a situation where these two vectors will be completely opposite signs, right, in each dimension. Then this number will be small. And by being small, I mean something close to 0. 1 minus 0 will still something close to 0 will give us 1. It means that we need to push the central vector cat a lot towards the vector for the word cute, right? Because almost the whole vector cute needs to be added to the word cat to kind of bring them closer together. And we do that again and again. We just run through the corpus again and again. And hopefully, at the end, we end up with some kind of good vector representation of these different words in multidimensional spaces. What I can do, having done that on this corpus, I can ask, please give me 10 most similar words for a particular term. And let's do that. But because before I do that, I need to explain this one more thing. This is the temporal referencing thing. Just to give you an example, we have a Chinese text from, let's say, Ming-Qing period. We find a word of interiority. We just change it into hard Ming-Qing because it's from the Ming-Qing period. Again, if we have the text from the contemporary period, we find something about interiority. We change that to hard contemporary. And we do that for every word in every interiority related word in the whole corpus. And we run word to back on this huge corpus of texts and then ask, for example, give me 10 most similar words to hard contemporary. And this is what we get. And when I first saw that, I was really, really impressed. I think this is really an amazing result. Actually, it turned out it's not as amazing as I thought. But the computer sometimes is able to recuperate the similarity between the tagged words, despite there being no a priori indication that they are in any way related, right? Similar, because as I explained just now, you remove all this word data, you just have numbers. So it's able to find all 5 words, all hard related terms, as being the nearest neighbors in this huge multidimensional vector space, which means that not much changed. That's my interpretation of this graph, that actually the notion that there are some powerful, wide-ranging epistemic shifts that separate different epochs from each other, needs to at least account for this kind of results, needs to kind of take it into consideration. And we can see how these terms change, right? So we can see that socialist hard in the Maoist period is very close to the contemporary hard. Like there's very little change. There is some change from Republican period again. The huge jump, the biggest jump is actually from the Qing, Ming-Qing, and late Qing periods. So here is the so-called revolution of the hard as it happened. So we can actually quantify this semantic shift here. And we have controls here. So we can control if it's just a random result or if it really is anchored in the data. So what I do first is that I attach a random tag to these words. Can you guess what happens if I attach a random tag to each word instead of doing it according to the period? I just add, like, let's say, contemporary tag to texts that appear in Ming-Qing period and late Qing tag to socialist period. If I just mix them all together, can you guess what happens? Well, this happens. So basically, because they all get information from all different periods, right? A little bit of context from Ming-Qing, a little bit of context from the Republican. For the computer, they are essentially the same. And most importantly, their neighbors, other neighbors, are still emotionally related. So these are, because they appear within the same context, it's just that they are swapped with each other across corpora. Therefore, these words are similar to each other. And they are still emotion related. That's crucial because there's another control, which is the random position. So now what we do is I remove these tags from the sentences and I place them somewhere else, just randomly in the corpus. Can you guess what happens then? If I just take word hard from one sentence and just throw them somewhere else completely randomly. Actually, so they become like grammatical particles, because grammar is precisely what kind of appears everywhere, right? It's like completely semantically blind because it can appear in various different contexts, and hard starts resembling a grammatical particle such as le, which is maybe approximated to like past tense, but I mean, I haven't said that. Some linguists will be unhappy, or pronouns for bad, because the hard appears so often after these changes that I made to the vocabulary that actually they start behaving like pronouns. Hard is, yeah. So having said that, we see here that there is change, but there's also an amazing continuity in the corpus. So the representations of interiority do not undergo such a significant change as it has been suggested by, I think, the last 50 years of scholarship focus on these diachronic changes and epistemic shifts, revolutionary movements, etc. What is even more interesting, these are like other studies I conducted with different parameters, hyperparameters, and they're roughly corroborate the insights. What is interesting is that now that we have this multidimensional space, we can trace the travel of the heart as it moved across this many dimensions. So for example, here we start from heart in Qing and we move through space to late Qing. And then the heart slightly moves to another place in the space, to the Republican period, sorry, to the socialist period, and then to the contemporary period. This is obviously idealized and sanitized because in fact, the space looks something like this in 3D projection. So there are like hundreds of thousands of words, plenty of points that are distributed in this multidimensional space that is very difficult to imagine. And the heart moves just slightly from one position to another. And the heart moves and it becomes biased towards certain terms. It moves away from certain terms and it is biased towards other terms. So now by finding the closest neighbors of each heart at each time space, we can see towards which words the heart becomes biased and from which words it escaped. And that's exactly what I did. So as we move from Ming-Qing period, we move closer to these words. And these are, for example, these are mostly government official posts. This is late Qing stories about, again, foreign intrusion, kind of a lot happens in different provinces. The governors of different provinces are trying to deal with the Western imperialism, also dramatic social changes. Also, it might be biased because the corpus, as I have it, is perhaps skewed toward this kind of text. And then we move to Republican period, and this actually accords with the findings so far. So these are really emotional terms. Like the heart becomes this center of emotional activity. There's a lot of words like feeling, memory, enthusiasm, vehemently or powerfully, feeling, etc. We move to socialist period, and we get branch secretaries, party, Communist Party, the Liberation Army, militia, the masses. So the heart is skewed towards this very politicized term. And if we move to the contemporary period, we have a mixture of different terms like emperor names, Buddhas. I think there's a lot of language of prayer also, which shows that, commonsensically, the socialist period was not really welcoming to religion and spiritual life. So therefore, we can see this movement here as well. Okay. So let me suggest that one more type of visualizations. We can see how the heart moves in space, and we can see also how this kind of visualization can help us think about what the literary historians have been doing so far. Here we have a 2D projection, and we have words related to the Republican discourse, these kind of highly emotionally charged words, which I just shown. And here is the socialist vocabulary related to cadres, political parties, etc. I have seeded this representation with two hearts so that it's roughly aligned along this line. So the history moves this way, moves top and to the right. This is the vector of history, and the words on the left signify the kind of biases of the Republican period. The words on the right signify the biases of the socialist period. So if we remove the seeds, and then what we can do is to draw a line. And this I think, procedure resembles what the literary historians have been doing. So we simply draw lines or in spaces trying to delimit two different discursive formations. So that is an epistemic shift. It might be where modernity starts. It might be the rise of the novel, rise of the subject. This might be a shift between modernism and postmodernism. It might be whatever you want, but this is what scholars have been doing, drawing lines in spaces. We can add more terms here. We can see this is getting a little bit difficult to read. So let's remove the labels. And if we add a few more points, we can see that still there's a little more outliers outside of this line than the words that appear along the line, close to the line. Let's add even more. It's kind of getting almost equal, and even more. And that's what happens when you have like 5,000 words here. And you can see that as we add more and more words, the change becomes gradual. So basically we can remove the line. And here is the continuity as I see that. Okay. Okay, so I think this distinction between the continuity and discontinuity is really essential for kind of us moving forward. As Ted Underwood puts it in his Why Literary Periods Matter, distant reading or digital humanities tools, as the one presented here, can actually travel literary historicism very profoundly, because quantification can make it possible to describe change without articulating it as a series of discrete phases at all. And this is something that I believe that Foucauldian framework, for example, is unable to account for. And this is the contribution that PH can really make to literary studies. Okay, so we are getting to the end of this presentation. And I would like to end this with a close reading, because after all, humanists should do some reading as well. It's not only about multidimensional spaces and vectors, etc. So let's see what happens if we adopt this perspective and to read a text. And now here I would like to draw attention to Ye Xin's novel published in 1980s entitled Vanished Years, or 蹉跎岁月. It's a text describing the sorrowful fate of many young people in China in 1960s and 70s during the Cultural Revolution, as they were forcefully sent to the countryside to so-called learn from the peasants and re-educate themselves in the countryside. So the far western regions of China, where Ye Xin was also sent in 1960s, provided an inspiration for his novel published in 1980s, as I just said. So it describes a story. It's a story of two lovers, He Bizhou, who is this alter ego of the author, kind of a youngster, who is very kind of weak-willed. He's very not certain of his own abilities, even though he turns out to be a great organizer. He is burdened with awareness that his family comes from a wrong class background, actually. So this obviously places him at a disadvantage compared to Du Jianchun, who is his lover-to-be, who actually comes from a wealthy family from Shanghai, but actually wealthy family in the communist period. So she is kind of she's this figure who's very self-assured, very self-confident, and at first the class background makes it impossible for them to connect. So she's a little bit like Qin Yanzi, who is said to have left the comfort provided by her father, who was a prosperous factory manager, and instead decided to return to the countryside to improve the lives of the peasants. I think she's modeled on this kind of character, or very revolutionary inspired figure, the Iron Girl kind of thing. And as in this quote shows, she's actually astonished when it turns out that He Bizhou came to the countryside not on his own volition, not on his own accord. He was forced to do that. And she says, what? Didn't you come to the countryside to participate in the revolution and receive re-education for the poor farmers? You are so backwards. You're so backwards, so backward. He Bizhou's heart was pierced by these two sentences. He closed his eyes and nodded in admission. Yes, I'm really backward. Really backward. 真落后, 真落后. Actually, towards the middle of the story, it turns out that all this revolutionary fervor was in vain, because she herself, her own family loses grace. Her family suffers from political persecution during the Cultural Revolution. So everyone actually is suffering, and she's also violently beaten by local thugs who kind of take advantage of this irregular situation on the ground where the party state does not function. And she's asking herself, what would the right way be to spend her youth? How should she do justice to her youth? Because she was full of these heroic words, strong and resolute, but these words can't change her situation or fill the emptiness in her soul. And you can see here as the author uses all these different terms for interiority. He uses the brain, something similar to a soul, or again, a metaphor of the heart that we already discussed. So it is said that her flame is slowly losing its intensity. And towards the end of the story, they actually are able to stand on their own to go against the parental impositions and decisions, and actually they get on a train together, and this time is the Nauhai that is used by Ye Xin. So he describes this scene where they get on the train together to drive to the countryside, to leave Shanghai, and actually to start their life together. That is, and the relationship is purely based on feelings rather than on class considerations. And I think I only suggest this novel here, very kind of superficial, fast, close reading, because I think it constitutes a moving spectacle of discontinuity and continuity, externalism and internalism. So both protagonists change over the course of the novel. From a weak-willed and depressed young man, he, in his heart, becomes kind of a collective-minded and inspired activist. She, on the other hand, reevaluates her attachment to the language of class struggle and instead prioritizes feelings. At the same time, there's continuity of representation. So if we change this novel into this visualization, it is actually 100 by 100 graph, where each point represents 0.01% of the text, roughly 18 words, and then we tag every fragment that contains the word xin or heart with a blue dot. We can see that heart appears everywhere. The novel is simply constantly about the heart. And in this, I situate the continuity of representation. The interiority is a stable mode of thinking about feelings and how they are represented in the text. On the other hand, the externalist viewpoint is exemplified through the connection between outside events, the Cultural Revolution, the painful experiences of the sent-down youth, at the same time as the internalist vector also enters the picture, because the story is, again, mostly about what happens inside the heart rather than outside. Okay, so this leads me to the conclusion. I believe that these computational models, like the one I presented here, offer a unique perspective on the problem of interiority, accounting for all four poles in the graph: the diachrony, the synchrony, internalism, and externalism. And while it is not certain what metaphor exactly will prevail, whether it's the neurocentric or the cardiocentric model, we can be sure, I believe, that they will partake in the language of interiority. I would like to end here. I would like to also acknowledge many people who contributed to this project, especially Matthew Palmer, friend and amazing office mate with whom I had great discussion. He specializes in Chinese linguistics, and it's really contributed to this project enormously. And also my colleagues and friends from Stanford ELC, Aaron Gippius and India Shui Xiaoyu Wang, for helping also with the corpus. Melissa Hosek from Stanford Civic Global Education, Winnie Chang, with whom I had a chance to participate through the Stanford Foothill Community Exchange Program. That was a great opportunity to work together. Iwan Wang from Zhejiang and Fudan University. Stanford Literary Lab, who are folks there, helped me when I presented this talk for the first time, and also with the control measures that I presented in the talk. That was very extremely helpful advice that I received. And the Stanford Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis for allowing this talk to happen. Thank you.
We have a little time for a Q&A, so I want to open this up. And for folks that are joining remotely, if you want to raise a question, if you can signal in some way, maybe with an emoji hand, so that we know that you're ready to join the conversation. I'll try to keep an eye on that. But
thanks so much for the talk, and I wanted to actually compliment you specifically on how clear you were in explaining what you do. I do a little bit of work in word embedding models, and I found myself becoming more confident in what I do by listening to your explanations of it. So that's really great. One thing I think I saw in your early slides was that there was one of these assumptions about word embedding models that the rest of the words won't change. And so I was wondering, is that an assumption that you think about? Like, let's pretend heart is moving between Qing and contemporary and everything. What if soul is moving? What if provincial governor is moving too? Is that a risk that we have to think about when we think about these semantic shifts?
That's definitely a risk. Thank you so much for the question. That's definitely a risk to think about. The problem is that if, for example, we do acknowledge that everything changes, then we need to train a separate model for each period. And to align these models with each other will be very difficult. There's a lot of noise. I think this is called Procruste's problem, where you have to model dimensional spaces and you're trying to kind of put them together so that one vector in this space can be compared with vector in another space. It's really difficult. And this particular solution is actually offers a very simple way of thinking about these things. But I definitely acknowledge that this assumption can actually account for many results that we have it. At the same time, because these results, especially the diachronic shifts, can correspond with what we already know. Therefore, I'm sure that in a way, these results are valid to larger or smaller extent. But yeah, thank you for the question.
I just wanted to follow up on that question about whether you've used or considered using another control for a word that you don't expect to have any or less meaningful change over time, something like horse or stone, and to see if any of the same patterns emerge. And if so, how can we attribute that to sin versus just overall change in language over time?
That's actually a wonderful question. And yes, that's why I said that when I saw that result for the first time, I thought it's amazing. It turned out to be less amazing than it should be, because if you actually, for example, I use 先生 or 老师, these kind of terms, we also see the change, but the computer is also able to recuperate these relationships. And again, I think it's attributable in part to this assumption that non-target words remain semantically stable. But this does not invalidate the argument that there is a stability in the corpus in a way. So even though this is a different problem also, because I'm particularly interested in the heart, representative of the heart, whereas this question would be about stability of language as a whole, if we can say it this way. So I did some additional studies, conducted additional studies, kind of trying to input different words, and these results were comparable. But again, I think the argument still holds that we can think about corpora as being relatively stable in time, rather than just focusing on drawing the lines in space.
I have a question. I think in your conclusion, you talked about how this shows that interiority is important. And I mean, I obviously agree with that. But a question I had then is, have you considered other aspects of interiority? Do you feel that this is the most important, that the use of the word heart is the most important way to show interiority in Chinese novels? Yeah, or is this just one aspect of interiority? And yeah, how would that impact your conclusion?
So I'm sure that not only in Chinese, but in all different Chinese languages, but also in many other languages, you have different ways of representing interiority. I focus on Xin because, first of all, it's such a powerful metaphor and omnipresent. And also there's been a lot written on it, so there's research that I can draw upon. But I'm sure that there are also other terms that you can use to describe interiority. Whether you can get rid of interiority as such, I think that's kind of my argument here, that it's impossible. So there will be some kind of interiority metaphoricization happening at any time, because as Damasio and Panksepp show, this idea that emotions are grounded in our bodies that have boundaries will be reflected in one way or another, whether it's this neurocentric view or cardiocentric. We can't just distribute cognitive functioning around the world, although embodied mind, extended mind theory does it. But I do think that the interiority metaphors as such will stay here for a long time.
Because there are also non-metaphorical ways of expressing interiority too.
Right. So Right, so that's another interesting question. So for example, Leslie Lockhead's book, she precisely thinks about metaphoricization as a process whereby at first heart is actually considered as a physical thing. Like they literally think about heart as having emotion, and that's why it moves. You have this constriction of the chest. They think that emotions are physical beings happening in somewhere inside of our bodies, and only later, as we discover that the brain actually has something to say, it undergoes metaphoricization, and it becomes just a metaphor rather than a physical entity, right? So this is, but yeah, I agree. Also, maybe you don't need even the words of interiority to represent interiority,
Exactly.
but then the question is whether you would be able to empathize with this kind of, you could sympathize with these kind of representations, but perhaps not empathize with them.
Thank you.
This is such an amazing project and a wonderful presentation. I really also appreciate the clarity and the way that you scaffolded all of the, the stuff that you're building. So my question maybe builds a little bit on Kat, maybe a different way of asking this. So obviously you're working with words, and that is how you're building this corpus. I'm wondering about the sort of outside of words, things like genre or kind of narrative structure, ways that we engage with texts that are not just coming out of the words alone, but that structure our interaction with the text. Can you account for those? I mean, where does that fit? If that's something that's important, maybe it's not, but if it is, how do you account for that in a project like that?
I conceive of representation of interiority as just one among many other mechanisms that are located in that can be identified in narrative texts. So obviously you have interiority, but then you have characterizations, you have characters that are somehow minor, sometimes there are major protagonists. You have certain narrative schema, such as, for example, the sublime schema, which I believe is perhaps also universally valid, which is to say that there are certain schematic narrative patterns that guide our emotionality, and you can also pay attention to them. But that's not part of this project, but you definitely, this is just one view on how emotionality is represented and constructed in text. I do agree that there's definitely need for a more global perspective, let's say, or kind of more granular reflection, and all these different technologies, as I call them, actually cooperate together to make this very powerful, effective impact on the reader as we kind of deal with text, fictional text. That would be my answer. Thank you for the question.
I think my question is related to the last two in some ways, that it's about the corpora and the concept of oversampling. And if you go back to the image, so just out of ignorance of when you showed us all the work that you had for the different periods and how, of course, the contemporary, that one.
That one.
So I just wondered, because of course, like when you look at it with your own knowledge, how much do you know of what makes this huge difference? I mean, and again, I come from a complete, so I don't know, is this how does this relate to actually what was painted in these different times? How much would you, someone with your knowledge in the field, how much can you tell of what's different apart from the amounts? And what are your concerns, if any?
Right. So
it makes a lot of sense that there would be more words and but word lines.
Right. So there are two ways to answer this question. So for how much I can say myself about these texts, I can say more about the texts that appear to the right side of this graph, because this is where I specialize or trained in. These earlier texts, by necessity, I know a little less about them, and therefore this is a collaborative effort. So therefore I think the age encourages working with scholars who really specialize in this, and I did do inquire about texts and whether the corpus is complete, quote unquote complete, whether it's kind of contains all the representative texts that are considered in kind of scholarship on these particular periods. So I did that. So this is one way of answering the question. Like I can tell as much as me and my collaborator can do. At the same time, we can ask certain statistical questions. For example, I can ask the computer to tell me which period uses the word hard most often. And surprisingly, it is the socialist corpus that employs the hard imagery. It's, I think, roughly every 700 words and there is the word hard appearing in the socialist period. It's often the case that hard, the writers describe some kind of hatred towards the capitalists or a landlord, right? Something like that. So this is very internalized. These are vehement, powerful emotions that push these characters around. So I can ask many different questions about the corpus. It depends on actually where my interest lies. I was more curious in representing this movement of the heart in space and towards which it moves closer and from which it kind of flees away.
I have a question on the formalization, or like I think there was one multidimensional model that you model the movement of the heart throughout history. And I was just wondering how can one interpret the actual meaning when we see something like this? Because from my initial understanding, when we approach a term in kind of literature, we don't really understand it in such kind of mathematic modeling way. And I don't know you come into context or who are the writer, who are the readers, and a lot of these things, because when I see this, I don't know how do I actually understand this kind of motion. Yeah.
That's a great question. So I think that's why I try to interpret this movement by checking towards which part of the space the vector moved, right? So this is how we can interpret it macroscopically by analyzing simply the movement of the heart from one subcorpus to another, and how this is just one way of interpreting that. Again, I think it depends on the scale of analysis. So you can adopt this perspective and read one single text, distant read a single novel, for example, and then see with what words does the word heart collocate most often. And then you obviously can include considerations of the author's background, the kind of historical events happening around the publication of the work. You can do that. I think at a larger scale, it's you lose this information, but you get more of this kind of information that perhaps would not be visible in this microscopic analysis.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. You've done so much cool stuff with this. I wondered, in the earlier periods, are you just working with vernacular Chinese?
Yes, with prosaic texts, these for the early modern period that includes Yanqing xiaoshuo, erotic novels. There's a lot of erotic texts in Ming Qing period. There's also this large xiaoshuo or big novels, as I mentioned. So these are mostly vernacular texts. It's not philosophical investigations like Wang Yaming or whoever else thought about the matters of the heart in Chinese philosophical tradition. It's mostly about the kind of narratives and stories. Yeah, so I would say it's mostly vernacular.
Well, yeah, I mean, originally I was thinking, because if you had classical Chinese stuff, that would affect the data because it's more compressed, right? But on the other hand, I guess one issue with only having that kind of material is that they'll discuss interiority in particular contexts and in particular ways. Whereas in more contemporary stuff, I suppose, I don't know what kind of text you're using with contemporary and socialist stuff, but in those periods, they're writing other kinds of text in vernacular as opposed to classical that they would have written in classical Chinese for the earlier periods. I wonder if that affects your thinking at all, or your analysis.
It definitely does, because these claims are only valid for the corpus I have. So this should be actually, I should have said that. So every DH project is by necessity limited by their own corpus. Maybe there are texts where this this phenomenon does not happen, although there are good reasons to believe that they are universally present. I tried to make this case somehow between the lines, but so in this sense, it definitely influences the way I think about it. At the same time, I do think that even if you included philosophical texts, it's still would make some sense, because after all, it's just statistics. You're trying to see how many times two words co-occur with each other as opposed to other words, right? So you could still do a similar analysis if you had a corpus with more theoretically minded texts.
Cool.
Well, like any